There are moments in war when silence speaks louder than gunfire, and what happened inside that crumbling compound on the outskirts of a forgotten valley was one of them. Picture this: a SEAL team pinned down behind shattered concrete walls, their radios screaming static, their ammunition dwindling, and their team leader bleeding from a wound that no tourniquet could fully silence. In the corner, half buried under a collapsed beam, lay a woman they had been told was the weakest link of the convoy. A Navy combat medic who walked with a limp from an injury she should have retired on. A soldier whose medical board had already stamped her file with the words, "limited duty." They had whispered about her behind her back. They had questioned why she was even attached to their mission. And now, as enemy fire chewed through the last of their cover and the youngest operator on the team began to pray under his breath, that same disabled medic dragged herself upright, planted her good leg into the dust, and reached for the rifle of the man dying beside her. The SEALs froze, not because she was a woman, not because she was wounded, but because in that single motion, every assumption they had ever made about strength collapsed. So I ask you before we go further, who decides when a soldier is too broken to fight? Tell me in the comments what you believe, because her answer is about to change everything. Her name was Petty Officer First Class Mara Ellison, and long before the world learned how she stood up that day, she had spent 22 years quietly building a reputation that lived only in the margins of after-action reports. She had grown up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the only thing louder than the church bells on Sunday morning was the freight train that cut through the valley at dawn. Her father had been a corpsman in Vietnam, a man who rarely spoke about what he had seen, but who taught her how to clean a wound, how to splint a broken arm, and how to keep her hands steady when someone else's life was leaking through her fingers. He used to tell her that medicine was not about saving people, it was about giving them the chance to save themselves, and that lesson would echo through every decision she ever made in uniform. When she enlisted at 19, she chose the Navy not for adventure, but because she believed the corpsman rating was the closest thing to her father's hands she could ever wear on her own sleeve. Her first deployment took her to a forward surgical team in Iraq, where she learned that triage was not a science, but a kind of brutal arithmetic, and that the youngest Marines were always the ones who held her wrist the tightest when the morphine started to take them under. She earned her first commendation pulling 2 wounded engineers out of a burning Humvee, and she earned her second by refusing to leave a dying interpreter alone in the back of a medevac helicopter. By the time she rotated home for the 3rd time, she had stopped counting the names she remembered and started counting only the ones she had failed to keep alive. Her superiors marked her as gifted, disciplined, and unusually calm under pressure. But what they never wrote in her file was the way she carried every loss home with her like a stone she refused to set down. She studied advanced trauma protocols on her own time, became one of the few corpsmen qualified to attach to special operations elements, and earned a quiet respect from the Tier 1 community that rarely opens its circle to outsiders. She did not chase the recognition, and she did not chase the rank. What she chased was something her father had whispered to her once on a porch in Tennessee, that the measure of a soldier is not what they survive, but what they refuse to abandon. And in the years that followed, Mara Ellison would refuse to abandon almost everything, including, eventually, her own broken body. The injury that nearly ended her career arrived not in the storm of combat, but in the silence of routine, which is often where soldiers fall the hardest. It happened during a training rotation in the high desert, when a fast rope insertion went wrong and the helicopter drifted 3 meters farther than the spotter had called. Mara hit the ground at an angle no human knee was designed to absorb, and the sound that came out of her right leg was the sound of a career folding in on itself. She did not scream. She did not cry. She lay in the dust, looked up at the sky, and methodically diagnosed her own injury the way her father had taught her, naming the torn ligaments out loud as if they belonged to someone else. The surgeons rebuilt what they could, but the damage to her tibial nerve left her with a permanent drop foot, a limp that worsened on long marches, and a medical board file that quietly recommended a discharge with full benefits. She was 38 years old, and the Navy was politely telling her that her usefulness had a stopping point. What the board did not understand was that Mara Ellison did not measure her usefulness in foot-pounds of pressure or in the number of pull-ups she could complete in 2 minutes. She filed an appeal. She underwent 18 months of rehabilitation that she paid for partly out of her own pocket, working with a civilian physical therapist who had once trained Olympic athletes. She relearned how to run, not gracefully but functionally, with a custom brace hidden under her trousers and a stride that compensated for what the nerve no longer told her foot to do. She passed her recertification by the smallest of margins, and she did it in front of a panel that had every reason to fail her. The compromise the Navy offered was a limited-duty assignment as a senior medical advisor to Special Operations Training Cadres, a role that kept her in uniform but kept her, in theory, far from the kind of mission that had broken her in the first place. She accepted the role because she understood the math of institutions, but she never accepted the premise that her fighting days were over. She continued to qualify on every weapon system she could access. She kept her tactical combat casualty care credentials sharper than operators half her age. She studied the after-action reports of every special operations engagement of the previous decade, and she built a quiet reputation among team leaders as the medic you wanted in your planning cell, even if the regulations said you could not have her on your assault element. When the request came for a senior medical advisor to accompany a SEAL element on a non-kinetic advisory mission to a partner force in a remote valley, her name was at the top of the list. The team leader who signed the manifest did so reluctantly, believing he was bringing along a clipboard, not a corpsman. The valley was supposed to be quiet, which is a word that experienced soldiers learn to distrust the way sailors learn to distrust a calm sea before a squall. The mission profile called for a 3-day visit to a partner force outpost, an assessment of their medical readiness, and a series of training rotations with their casualty care personnel. Mara was attached to a SEAL team of 8 operators led by a senior chief named Dalton Reeves, a man whose reputation for tactical excellence was matched only by his reputation for treating attached personnel as necessary inconveniences. He had reviewed her file on the flight in, and he had made his opinion clear in the kind of quiet way that senior chiefs make their opinions clear, which is to say he had assigned her a sleeping space near the perimeter and had not invited her to the team's planning huddle. The youngest operator on the team, a second-class petty officer named Cole Ramirez, was the only one who spoke to her with anything resembling warmth. He did so mostly because he had grown up with a mother who limped in much the same way Mara did, and her presence reminded him of a kindness he had been raised to extend without thinking. The first 2 days passed without incident. Mara conducted her assessments, ran her training rotations, and quietly noted the gaps in the partner force's medical posture. These included the absence of any prepositioned blood products and the dangerous over-reliance on a single junior medic. On the morning of the 3rd day, the outpost was scheduled for a routine resupply, and the SEAL element was scheduled to begin its extraction. What no one in the planning cell had accounted for was that a coordinated attack had been building in the surrounding hills for nearly a month, and that the resupply convoy itself had been the trigger the attackers had been waiting for. The first mortar round landed at 7 minutes past dawn, and it landed close enough to the outpost's southern wall that the concussion knocked Mara off the cot, where she had been organizing her medical kit. The second round took out the partner force's communications shed, and the third round collapsed a section of the inner courtyard where 2 of the SEAL operators had been finishing their breakfast. Within 90 seconds, the outpost was under coordinated small arms fire from 3 directions, and within 4 minutes, the SEAL element was pinned down behind a partial wall of shattered concrete, with no clear line of extraction and a casualty count that was already climbing. Senior Chief Reeves took a round through the upper thigh that severed his femoral artery, and the team's primary corpsman, a young petty officer named Briggs, was killed instantly by a fragment from the first mortar round. Cole Ramirez was the one who screamed Mara's name across the courtyard, and Mara, who had been thrown against a low wall and had felt something tear in her already damaged leg, dragged herself toward the senior chief through a haze of dust and gunfire that no medical board in the world had ever prepared her to cross. What happened in the next 11 minutes would later be reconstructed from helmet camera footage, radio recordings, and the testimony of the 6 SEAL operators who survived the engagement. Even then, the official report would describe events with the kind of clinical detachment that war reports always used to soften what really happened. Mara reached Senior Chief Reeves with her trousers torn, her brace cracked at the ankle hinge, and a level of pain in her leg that she would later describe as feeling like the bone itself was on fire. She did not stop to assess herself. She slammed a tourniquet onto the senior chief's thigh with a speed that came from 22 years of muscle memory, cinched it down past the point of comfort and into the point of survival, and watched the bleeding slow from a fountain to a trickle. He was conscious enough to swear at her, which she took as a good sign, and she shouted across the courtyard for Ramirez to bring her the team's casualty kit. While she worked, the enemy fire shifted, and a sustained burst from a heavy machine gun on the eastern ridge began to walk its way along the concrete wall the team was using for cover. The operator on the far end of the wall, a first class named Hanley, took a round through his shoulder plate carrier and went down hard. Mara stabilized the senior chief as quickly as she could, transferred his care to Ramirez with a clipped set of instructions about pressure and rechecks, and crawled along the base of the wall toward Hanley. By the time she reached him, 2 more rounds had cracked the concrete above her head, and a fragment had opened a shallow gash across her left forearm that she registered only as a distant warmth. She stabilized Hanley, established a casualty collection point in the lee of the partial wall, and began the brutal work of triage that her father had taught her was less a science than an arithmetic of mercy. She kept 3 men alive in those first minutes, and she did it while the leg she had rebuilt over 18 months of rehabilitation began to fail beneath her in ways she did not have the time to acknowledge. The team's remaining operators had organized a defensive perimeter, but their ammunition was being consumed at a rate that simple math would not allow them to sustain. Their attempts to raise the quick reaction force on the radio were being defeated by a jamming signal that the planning cell had not anticipated. Senior Chief Reeves, pale but conscious, looked at Mara through the dust and asked her how long she could keep them alive. She told him the truth, which was that she could keep them alive for as long as the casualty collection point held, but that if the eastern ridge was not suppressed, the casualty collection point would not hold. He nodded, and he tried to lift his rifle, and his hand would not close around the grip. He looked at the rifle, and then he looked at her, and what passed between them in that moment was the kind of understanding that 22 years of service had taught them both to recognize without words. The rifle she picked up was a standard-issue carbine with an optic she had qualified on every 6 months for the last decade. When she lifted it from the senior chief's lap, she did not lift it as a medic borrowing a weapon. She lifted it as a sailor who had spent 2 decades preparing for a moment she had hoped would never arrive. She braced herself against the broken wall, settled her weight onto her good leg, and took a knee in a way that the brace would still allow. The SEALs around her did not speak. Ramirez later said that he had felt something shift in the air, the way a room shifts when a person who has been quiet for a long time finally decides to speak. He said he had understood without being told that what he was watching was not improvisation, but the surfacing of something that had been there the whole time. Mara called out a fire control plan in the same clipped cadence she had used for triage, designating sectors, assigning targets, and coordinating with the team's designated marksmen to suppress the heavy machine gun on the eastern ridge. She did not take command from the senior chief, because the senior chief was still alive and still in command. But she filled the gap that his wound had opened in the team's cohesion the way a corpsman fills a wound with gauze, with deliberate pressure and without apology. Her first 3 rounds were aimed not at the heavy machine gun, but at the spotter she had identified on the ridge above it, a figure she had picked out by the glint of optics during a momentary lull in the dust. She hit him on the second round. The heavy machine gun went silent for the 17 seconds it took the enemy to reorganize, which was exactly the window the team's marksman needed to range the position and bring it under sustained fire. The defensive perimeter stabilized. The casualty collection point held. Ramirez later described those 17 seconds as the moment the entire engagement turned, and the senior chief, when he gave his testimony from a hospital bed 3 weeks later, would describe them in almost the same words. Mara held her position for another 6 minutes, rotating between her rifle and her medical kit with a discipline that her instructors at the Corpsman School would have recognized as the highest form of their craft. It was the kind of professionalism that does not separate the work of healing from the work of fighting, because it understands that on a battlefield like this one, the two are the same. The quick reaction force broke through the jamming signal at the 17-minute mark, and the first relief helicopters arrived 11 minutes after that. By the time the medevac birds lifted the wounded out of the courtyard, the senior chief was stable. 3 other operators had been pulled back from the edge of bleeding out. And the partner force's junior medic, who had been paralyzed by fear in the opening minutes of the attack, was working alongside Mara with the quiet competence of someone who had been shown, rather than told, what courage looks like in practice. The aftermath of that morning unfolded in the slow, bureaucratic way that all military aftermaths unfold, with debriefings and medical evaluations, and the careful reconstruction of helmet camera footage by analysts who had never set foot in the valley. Mara was evacuated with the rest of the wounded, and the surgeons who examined her leg told her, with the kind of gentleness that surgeons reserve for soldiers they admire, that the damage she had sustained during the engagement had likely ended any hope of her returning to limited duty, let alone full duty. She received the news without expression, the way she had received most news in her life, and she asked only one question, which was whether the senior chief was going to live. He was. So was Hanley. So were the 2 other operators she had stabilized at the casualty collection point. The Navy awarded her the Silver Star for her actions that morning, and the citation, which was read aloud at a ceremony she attended in her dress uniform with a cane she had decorated herself, described her as having displayed conspicuous gallantry in the face of grave danger while attached to a special operations element. What the citation did not describe, because citations never do, was the conversation she had with Senior Chief Reeves 3 weeks after the engagement. He sat across from her in a hospital room in Germany and apologized for every assumption he had made about her on the flight in. She told him that she did not need his apology, that what she needed was for him to write the kind of after-action report that would make it easier for the next medic with a limp and a file full of compromises to be taken seriously. He wrote that report. He wrote it in language that left no room for ambiguity, and he submitted it through channels that ensured it would be read by the people who write doctrine. Mara was medically retired 6 months later, with a full pension and a closet full of awards she rarely wore. She returned to the small town in eastern Tennessee where her father, now in his late 70s, was waiting for her on the same porch where he had once told her that the measure of a soldier is not what they survive, but what they refuse to abandon. She took a job teaching tactical combat casualty care to civilian first responders, and she wrote a curriculum that emphasized the integration of medical and tactical decision-making in austere environments. That curriculum is now used by training cadres across multiple branches of service. She speaks at conferences when she is invited, and she always opens her remarks with the same line, which is that the most dangerous assumption a soldier can make is the assumption that someone else's body is the measure of their worth. What Mara Ellison did in that courtyard was not a miracle, and it was not the kind of impossible heroism that lives only in films and recruiting posters. It was the patient, ordinary, accumulated result of 22 years of preparation, of refusing to accept the limits that institutions had tried to place on her, of treating every day in uniform as an opportunity to be ready for a moment she hoped would never arrive. She was a woman who had been told her body had failed her, and who had decided that the failure of a body was not the same as the failure of a soldier. She was a medic who picked up a rifle not because she wanted to, but because the man whose rifle it was could no longer lift it himself, and because the team around them needed someone to hold the line for the 17 seconds it would take to turn an engagement around. Her story is a quiet rebuke to every assumption that strength is something visible, that capability is something that can be measured by a stopwatch or a stride, and that the soldiers who matter most are always the ones with the loudest reputations. The truth that her life teaches is older than the Navy and older than the country she served, which is that real strength is the sum of what a person has been willing to endure in private for the sake of a moment they may never face in public. She endured 18 months of rehabilitation for 17 seconds on a ridge. She endured a medical board that wanted to retire her so that she could be there when a senior chief needed a tourniquet. She endured every whispered doubt so that a young operator named Ramirez could see, with his own eyes, what it looks like when a soldier refuses to abandon the people beside her. If her story stays with you tonight, let it stay as a reminder that the wounded are not the weak, that silence is not the same as absence, and that the people who carry the most are very often the people who ask for the least.